For 20 months, I believed I was the only man in her life. For 20 months, I transferred money, bought gifts, made plans, whispered about the future, and slept soundly in the certainty that what we had was real and singular and mutual. What I didn't know, what I was too proud and too logical to suspect, was that I was one of three. 3 foreign men, 3 separate illusions, 3 monthly bank transfers flowing into the same account. I was the British one, there was an American, there was a German. And there was Pinsri, managing all 3 of us with the cool efficiency of someone running a moderately successful small business, which is, I have come to understand, precisely what we were to her. I'm Clive Henderson. I'm 63 years old. I spent the better part of my working life building a commercial cleaning business in the Midlands, industrial contracts, office complexes, a few NHS facilities sold it at 58, for a number I'm not going to share because it's not relevant, and arrived in Bangkok with more money than sense, and, apparently, more loneliness than I was willing to admit to myself at the time. I want to be honest about that part. It matters to the story in ways I only understood later. I had been divorced for 11 years by the time I met her. My children were grown and living their own lives, which they should be, which is exactly as it ought to be. My house was quiet. Thailand wasn't a midlife crisis. I was past midlife by any reasonable reckoning, but it was something. An escape dressed up as an adventure. I told myself I was drawn to the culture, the food, the pace of life, the warmth of the people, the sense that a man my age could still feel genuinely alive somewhere. All of that was true in its way. But the truth beneath the truth, the thing I was least keen to examine directly, was that I was 61 years old, and I didn't want to grow old alone in a terraced house in Wolverhampton, watching television and waiting for the grandchildren to visit on bank holidays. I met Pinsri through one of the popular dating applications. She was 25 at the time, described herself in her profile as an online seller. She ran a small shop through one of the Thai e-commerce platforms, selling skincare products and imported accessories, the kind of enterprise that many young urban Thai women were building in those years as digital retail expanded. Her profile was modest by the standards of the app. Her photos were tasteful. No provocative angles, nothing that would trigger the defensive skepticism that most long-term expats carry into these encounters. She looked like a young professional, neat, pleasant, direct camera gaze. She wrote in careful, slightly formal English that suggested she had worked at it, that she took it seriously. She said she was looking for something serious, something stable. She said she was tired of Thai men who treated women as afterthoughts. I remember reading that particular line and thinking it was admirable, that here was a woman with self-respect and standards. It didn't occur to me, not then, that it was a line she had tested on several men before me and refined through iteration for maximum effect. Our first video call lasted 3 hours. I remember it being late evening for me. I was still in England at the time, considering the move, and mid-morning for her. She was warm without being clingy, curious without seeming transactional. She asked real questions about my life in England, about the business I'd built and sold, about my children, about what I was hoping to find in Thailand beyond the tourist brochure version. She laughed at my jokes with what seemed like genuine amusement. She told me about her mother in the Lat Phrao district, about a younger brother studying engineering at a university in Chonburi, about her small apartment near Lat Phrao and the market she liked to walk through on Sunday mornings. She had texture, context, a life that felt inhabited and real because it mostly was. That was always the sophisticated part of what she did. She wasn't inventing a person wholesale. She was curating an existing person with great precision, presenting the version of herself most likely to produce the response she needed from a man like me. By the 3rd week, she was calling me Talak. By the 6th week, I had booked flights. My first visit to Bangkok lasted 3 weeks. And I want to describe it carefully because I think the description is instructive. It was. And I can say this now with the particular lucidity that comes from knowing exactly how badly you were fooled, almost perfect in its execution. She met me at the airport with a small handwritten sign, which I found both charming and slightly old-fashioned. She had made a reservation at a restaurant she thought I would like, a place in Ari that did northern Thai food and had a quiet garden. She had researched what I mentioned liking. Small thing, enormous effect. She was attentive and physically affectionate in the gentle, unhurried way that is different from performance, or at least felt different, which may amount to the same thing. She took me to her neighborhood, to the market she'd described on our calls, to a temple in Nonthaburi, where she lit incense and knelt and prayed in the particular interior stillness that I found, watching her, unexpectedly moving. I stood to one side in that smoke-sweet air and felt something I hadn't felt in years, the quiet tenderness of believing you understand someone, of believing that you see them in some essential way that others have missed. I was not a romantic by history. I had run a business for 30 years, and I knew how people behaved under incentive and pressure. I had negotiated contracts, managed employees, handled suppliers who cut corners, and clients who moved goalposts. I was not someone who mistook charm for character as a rule. I told myself this frequently during those first weeks in Bangkok. I was not naive. The problem with not being naive, the deep structural problem with intelligence applied to wishful thinking, is that it makes you extraordinarily good at rationalizing what you want to be true. A stupid man ignores the evidence. A clever man explains it away. I was very clever about explaining things away for a very long time. She moved in with me into a rented condo I'd taken in the On Nut area after my 4th visit, approximately 8 months into the relationship. It made financial sense, which was always how I thought about everything. I was paying for the apartment regardless. She would save her rent money and reinvest it into her online business, which I had also contributed to by that point. 220,000 baht, roughly £5,000, to expand her product range, improve her packaging, and begin advertising on a couple of platforms. I told myself it was an investment in a capable person. I told myself I was backing talent I could identify and verify. I gave it a business logic because that was the language in which I processed the world, and because business logic felt more dignified than simply saying that I was in love with a woman 36 years younger than me and I wanted her to feel secure enough to stay. That was the fatal flaw, if I'm going to be honest about its shape. I was the logical rationalist, and the rationalist's weakness is not that he thinks too much. It's that he thinks in the wrong register. Emotion is not a problem to be solved. It cannot be analyzed into safety. When you encounter something that doesn't quite fit a phone left face down, a schedule that doesn't fully account for itself, a new purchase without a credible explanation, and you treat it as a data anomaly to be explained rather than a signal to be felt, you leave yourself profoundly exposed. I had an entire operating system for understanding the world, and it was perfectly calibrated for every situation except the one I was in. The first thing that unsettled me was so small that I am embarrassed to admit how many hours I spent turning it over in my mind. She had always kept her phone with the screen facing up, the volume on, no anxiety in her body language about it being in plain sight. I noticed, sometime around month 15 of our relationship, that this had quietly changed. The phone was now routinely face down on the table beside the sofa, on the kitchen counter, on the bed when she was dressing. Not dramatically. Not in a way I could challenge without seeming paranoid and controlling. Just often enough, and consistently enough, that I registered it. I noted it the way I used to note small inconsistencies in supplier invoices, filed, not yet significant, to be returned to. Then there was the Tuesday and Thursday pattern. Pensri had always been flexible with her schedule, the nature of her online work allowing her to structure her days loosely. But I began to notice that on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons reliably, approximately every week, she would announce that she was going to visit her friend Juanita. I had met Juanita briefly once, at a shopping center near Siam. She seemed a perfectly genuine person, ran a modest cosmetics wholesale operation, had been friends with Pensri since their school years in the Lat Phrao neighborhood. I had no reason to question the visits. I noted them anyway. The new phone arrived in month 16. She said she had bought it herself with savings. It was a top-of-the-range model, noticeably more expensive than anything her e-commerce income, as I understood it, could comfortably absorb. I asked, in my measured and reasonable way, whether it was a wise purchase given her current cash flow. She said she deserved something nice, smiled, and moved on to another subject. I spent 3 days analyzing that exchange and concluded it was consistent with a young woman treating herself after a period of hard work. I moved on. My left eye had begun to twitch slightly around this time. I attributed it to screen fatigue. The cologne was harder. I don't wear cologne, have never worn it. She knew this. One evening in late October, when she returned from a Juanita visit, I caught not strongly, just a thread of it in the air, as she passed close to me in the hallway, something unmistakably masculine. Warm, woody, the kind of thing that costs more than it should. She went directly to the bathroom to shower. She always showered after coming home, which I had long attributed to Bangkok's heat and the city's particular mixture of exhaust and humidity. That evening I stood in the kitchen making tea, and I thought, there is a rational explanation for this. I found 4 of them before the kettle boiled. I selected the best one and put the others away. I went to bed. I did not sleep especially well. There was the evening she received a message and turned slightly away from me to read it, and then she laughed quietly, involuntarily, before composing her face and turning back. The laugh was the thing. It was the kind of laugh that happens when you've forgotten yourself for a moment, the kind that escapes before you've decided whether it should. She recovered within a second. I noted it. There was the weekend her mother was supposedly ill and she needed to travel home to Lat Phrao, during which I occupied myself walking along the Chao Phraya and feeling, for the first time, with any real intensity, the particular loneliness of a man alone in a foreign city whose entire reason for being there was elsewhere. There was the new pair of earrings she wore, once small gold things I didn't recognize, that she said were old from university. I looked at them closely, and they were not old, but I said nothing. By month 17, I had 23 separate observations logged in a note on my phone. I am completely serious about this. I had a note, dated, specific. Behavioral changes, timestamps, my rationalization of each, I had not shown it to anyone. I had barely looked at it myself after entering each item, the way one enters an expense and immediately closes the ledger. The shame of maintaining that note was acute and private. It wasn't shame about being suspicious. I half hoped I was wrong. I hoped it constantly. It was shame about what it said about me, that I could observe 23 separate things that troubled me and still not act on any of them. I was conducting a passive surveillance operation on my own relationship and doing absolutely nothing with the intelligence gathered. This was not the behavior of a rational man. This was the behavior of a rational man who had decided, at a level below conscious reasoning, that he would rather not know. Graham was the one who finally said something out loud. Graham is a Scottish man who has been living in Bangkok for the better part of a decade, one of those expats who has made every available mistake at least once and has thereby accumulated the specific wisdom that comes from systematic error. He had met Pensri twice. He was careful with his words, in the way people become careful when careless words have cost them significantly in the past. He texted me in late November asking if I had time for a drink, which was unusual enough. He was more the type you ran into than the type who arranged things that I paid attention. We sat on Sukhumvit with a pair of Singha beers, and he looked at me with the expression of a doctor looking at a patient presenting symptoms they'd prefer not to diagnose. And he told me carefully that a mutual acquaintance had mentioned something he felt I probably needed to know. He told me that Brooks, a semi-retired American who lived in a serviced apartment near ASOC and whom I knew slightly from shared expat circles, had seen Pensri at a hotel on Sukhumvit. Not a budget hotel. A proper mid-range place. The kind of lobby you dressed for. With a man, younger, clearly Western, clearly not someone from her social or professional circle given the context of how they were together in that lobby, which Brooks had been specific about. Brooks had been uncertain whether to say anything and had eventually mentioned it to Graham. I told Graham that Brooks had almost certainly made a mistake. I said it with complete, relaxed confidence. I said Bangkok was full of young Thai women who might superficially resemble Pensri, that a brief glimpse in a hotel lobby was not identification, that misidentification happened constantly in a city of this size. Graham looked at me with the expression of a man who has watched this particular scene play out before, the reasonable calm, the explanatory fluency, the polite and total rejection of unwelcome information, and he let it go. We finished our beers and talked about other things. Driving home that night I was not calm. My left eye twitched all the way back to On Nut. I didn't say anything to Pensri that evening. I sat in the living room after she had gone to bed, and I thought about everything I had been not thinking about for months. I laid it out in my mind like items spread on a conference table before a difficult meeting. The phone face down, the Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, the new handset she couldn't properly explain. The cologne in the hallway, the involuntary laugh, the old earrings that were not old, the unexplained hotel charges I had seen, fleetingly, in the bank statements months ago and attributed without real investigation to merchant processing errors. The image Graham had just handed me of Pensri in a hotel lobby with another man. I laid all of these things out and looked at them together rather than individually for the first time, and the picture they composed was not one I could continue to argue with through the application of cleverness. I waited for a Wednesday morning when she was in the shower. I opened my laptop and I pulled up 12 months of our joint household account statements, the account we'd set up to manage shared expenses for the condo and living costs, and I read it properly for the first time. Not the glancing administrative review I'd given it periodically. A full reading, the way I used to read a set of company accounts when I was considering acquiring a business, looking for the things that weren't supposed to be there. The hotel charges were there throughout the entire 16 months I examined. 14 of them, 3 different hotels in central Bangkok. The Rembrandt appeared twice. A smaller hotel on Phetchaburi Road appeared 4 times. A boutique place in Thonglor, and here is the detail that landed with particular weight, was a hotel I had actually walked past once during one of our early days in the neighborhood and remarked on as looking pleasant. None of these hotels corresponded to anything we had done together. None of the dates were dates I had been away from Bangkok. Every single one of them fell on a Tuesday or a Thursday afternoon. I sat with the laptop while the shower continued running, and I cross-referenced every date against my own memory, the way an auditor cross-references. Each one landed with specific, nauseating weight. The Thonglor charge a Tuesday, 4 in the afternoon, corresponded exactly to a Juanita visit I could specifically recall because we had had a minor disagreement the evening before about something insignificant, and she had been slightly cool with me in the morning, and then noticeably warmer when she returned that evening. I had attributed the warmth to reconciliation. I now understood what it was. The warmth was guilt, or perhaps just the residue of afternoon. I was not sure which was worse. She came out of the bathroom. I heard her moving in the bedroom, opening the wardrobe. She came into the living room and said, "Good morning," and asked if I wanted coffee. I turned the laptop toward her so she could see the screen clearly, and I said nothing else. I waited. She looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I watched her face move through several expressions in rapid succession, something that might have been calculation brief, almost imperceptible, the micro-expression of someone assessing a situation before deciding how to respond, then performed concern, then a settling into what I recognized, in retrospect, as a rehearsed, defensive position. She said, "What is this?" I told her she knew what it was. She said the charges must be bank errors. She would call them today to sort it out. I told her I had already cross-referenced the dates with the Tuesdays and Thursdays. She said she didn't understand what dates had to do with anything. I mentioned the Thonglor Hotel specifically, the date, what she had told me she was doing that afternoon. I watched the gap in her story become visible to her as it was already visible to me, and watched her recognize that it was too precisely located to bridge with any available vagueness. She sat down across from me. The silence was long. Then she said, "Who told you?" "Not. Nothing happened. Not. You have misunderstood this completely." "Who told you?" As though the problem were a security breach, a failure of information management rather than the thing itself. As though the central failure were operational rather than moral. I told her nobody had told me anything. I told her I had read the bank statements. She looked at the laptop again briefly, with an expression I can only describe as momentarily professional. The expression of someone quietly calculating a liability, and then she began to cry. I want to be honest about those tears. I don't believe they were entirely false. I think she felt something real in that moment. Embarrassment, certainly, possibly a complicated relief at the end of an extended concealment, possibly something more genuine that I don't have access to and likely never will. What I'm confident she did not feel was what she wanted me to believe she felt, which was remorse. She said she was sorry. She said things had become complicated. She said she hadn't meant for it to develop this far. I asked her what it was, specifically, that had developed this far. She gave me a name, Derek. American. She said they had been seeing each other for about 6 months. He was a customer of her online business. They had started talking. She had been lonely when I was in England. It had escalated. She said Derek was kind to her. She said she wanted us to work through this together. She thought we could. I told her I didn't believe the timeline. 6 months didn't account for 14 hotel charges spread across 16 months. She said some of the earlier visits had been innocent, just lunch, nothing physical. I asked her about the other charges. She looked at her hands for a long moment. I said, very quietly, "How many are there, Pensry?" She told me about Matthias, German. She had met him through an online platform, separately from Derek and separately from me, approximately a year earlier. He visited Bangkok occasionally for work, something in logistics, she said vaguely, and she had been seeing him on those visits 3 or 4 times a year. She delivered this information with the slightly detached precision of someone summarizing an arrangement. She was not being cruel about it. She was simply being accurate, which, in the circumstances, was worse. I did the arithmetic. Myself, Derek, Matthias, a British retired businessman, an American of unspecified occupation, a German in logistics. 3 foreign men simultaneously maintaining what each believed to be an exclusive relationship with the same woman, each contributing monthly to her financial stability, each carefully scheduled into her Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, or her family visit weekends, or her Matthias is in town windows. I asked her directly whether she was receiving money from both of them as she was from me. She said yes. She said she needed financial security. She said she never knew how long any of us would stay, and she needed to protect herself. She said this not cruelly, not with any pleasure in my pain, but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone explaining a reasonable precaution that had perhaps been taken further than originally planned. She was describing risk management. I had spent 4 decades in business, and I recognized the framework even while sitting in the rubble of what I'd thought was my life. She had diversified her income streams. She had not put all of her farang in one basket. It was, by the cold arithmetic of portfolio theory, entirely rational. I did not shout. I've thought about this since, with some detached curiosity. I think it was because shouting requires surprise, and the surprise had drained out of me during the 10 minutes I spent reading the bank statements. The picture had simply completed itself. There was nothing left to be astonished by. I told her, in the quietest register I have ever used for anything, that I needed her to take what she needed for the immediate term and leave the apartment. She asked where she should go. I told her she appeared to have at least 2 other options. She flinched at that. It was the only moment in the entire conversation when I felt anything resembling clarity. She was gone within the hour. I sat at the kitchen table and read through my 23-point note from beginning to end. I owed it to the version of myself that had made each entry to finally read them without the filter of hope. I saw now the observations I had explained away with the most ingenuity: the laugh, the earrings, the weekend her mother was ill, the cologne. I saw how much effort I had expended over 17 months to not see what was entirely visible. The evidence had not hidden itself. I had hidden it from myself with great persistence and considerable intellectual effort. Graham came over that evening. He was kind in the way that only people who have made the same mistakes can be kind without a scrap of condescension. He told me about 3 other men he knew personally, who had been through something comparable, 2 of them with women who had been managing multiple foreign relationships simultaneously with what he described as impressive operational discipline. He said it was more common than the men involved ever admitted, because admission required acknowledging that you had been a budget line in someone's financial planning rather than a beloved person, and most men found that specific humiliation too structurally painful to absorb. I have turned that phrase over many times in the months since. A budget line. I don't think it's the complete picture. I believe Pensri felt something real for me, or felt something that functioned like real in the limited hours she allocated to me in her schedule. But the architecture of what she built around those feelings was economic. The scheduling, the parallel narratives, the 3 monthly transfers, the careful allocation of time and affection across 3 accounts, that architecture was the architecture of a business, regardless of what emotional content inhabited it. You can be genuinely cared for by someone who is also comprehensively using you. These things are not mutually exclusive. That is perhaps the most uncomfortable thing I know now that I did not know before. I left Bangkok 3 weeks after the discovery. I paid out the remaining 2 months on the condo lease and flew home. I am back in England now. I have been back 7 months. The house in Wolverhampton is quiet again, and I find the quality of the quietness is different from what it was before. Thailand less oppressive somehow, or perhaps I'm just different. The eye twitch cleared up about 6 weeks after I returned. I take that as a sign of something, though I couldn't tell you precisely what. The lessons I am left with are not dramatic. They are structural and specific, and I offer them in the spirit they were earned expensively and through sustained voluntary blindness. The first lesson is that analytical intelligence is not a defense against self-deception. It is, in the specific circumstances I found myself in, an engine for it. I had 23 data points that collectively pointed in one direction. I used my considerable reasoning capacity not to follow where they led, but to construct 23 separate explanations for why they didn't mean what they appeared to mean. The cleverer you are, the more sophisticated the rationalizations available to you. Intelligence in the service of denial is not a superpower. It is a liability. If your gut is telling you something and your brain keeps producing eloquent counterarguments, the problem is not your gut. The second lesson is about the material weight of the age gap. I was 36 years older than Pensri. I say this without self-recrimination, for the relationship itself, genuine connection between people of different ages is possible, and I don't disavow what I felt, but I was dishonest with myself about the economic and temporal consequences of that gap. A 25-year-old woman with her background has needs and fears and timelines that a 61-year-old man cannot fully address, and the distance between what I could genuinely offer and what she needed created the exact space that her system was designed to fill. I could have been honest about this from the beginning. I chose not to be, because the honesty would have complicated what I wanted. The third lesson is this. A woman who simultaneously maintains relationships with 3 foreign men, each of whom believes himself to be primary, is running a business. She may feel things within that business. The business may have emotional content. But the structure, the scheduling, the parallel fictions, the diversified income, the careful management of each relationship's access to her time that is enterprise, and you cannot love your way out of someone else's business model. You cannot be devoted enough, or generous enough, or analytical enough to convert a system into a relationship. The system exists because it was designed to appear to be a relationship while functioning as something else entirely. The fourth lesson concerns my own loneliness and what it did to my judgment. The quiet house in Wolverhampton, the 11 years since the divorce, the specific ache of knowing your best years of family life are behind you. None of that was Pensri's responsibility. But all of it made me urgently willing to believe in something I had insufficient evidence to believe in, and to maintain that belief against mounting counter-evidence for 17 months. Loneliness distorts perception. It makes warmth read as devotion and attention read as love. I was not an unintelligent man, I was a lonely one, and I was applying my intelligence primarily to the project of staying comfortable. The fifth lesson is the most actionable. Look at the bank statements, all of them, properly, with the same attention you would give to any document that might contain information you need. Because the evidence was there in plain figures for more than a year, and I did not look at it with honest eyes, because I did not want to find what was there to be found. The hotel charges did not hide from me. I looked at them and chose not to see them. If you share financial accounts with a partner, and something in your gut is uneasy, the statements will tell you something. Maybe not everything, but something. And something is where you begin. If you are reading this and recognizing pieces of your own situation in it, the face-down phone, the schedule with unexplained patterns, the new possession that doesn't quite add up, the friend who mentioned something and seemed reluctant to say more, I am not asking you to catastrophize. I am asking you to look clearly at what is actually in front of you. Ask the direct question. Look at the evidence you have available. Trust what you find rather than what you want to find. You cannot protect yourself with optimism. You can only see clearly and decide accordingly. I loved her. I believe some of what she felt for me was real. But love on my part and a managed system on hers coexisted for 20 months, and only one of us understood the full picture. That is the worst part, not the betrayal itself, but the asymmetry of it, the fact that she held the complete map while I navigated by landmarks she had arranged specifically for my benefit. The house is quiet. Some mornings it feels like peace. If you think this can't happen to you, I felt exactly the same way. I had the analysis to prove it. all 23 points of it. Look at the bank statement. I want to go back and describe the investigation phase more fully, because I think it is instructive and because I have spent enough time being embarrassed about it that I may as well be useful with it. After Graham's warning, and before I looked at the bank statements, there was a period of approximately 3 weeks during which I conducted what I can only describe as a low-grade covert operation on my own relationship. I am 63 years old and a former businessman, and I was checking timestamps on WhatsApp messages to see when she had last been active online, and I was cross-referencing those timestamps against what she had told me she was doing, and I was noting discrepancies in a phone document. The absurdity of this is not lost on me. It was not lost on me at the time either, which made it worse, because I couldn't stop. The WhatsApp timestamps were revealing but not conclusive. She was last active online at 11:30 on a Thursday night, after she had come home from what she said was a dinner with Juanita that had run late. I noted it. I noted 15 more things over the following 10 days and moved on from all of them too. I drove past Juanita's building once on a Thursday afternoon. I am fully aware of how this sounds. I drove past the building at approximately 3 in the afternoon, and I did not see Pensry's car. She had a small second-hand Honda she used for local travel anywhere in the immediate vicinity. But Bangkok street parking is complicated, and the absence of her car meant nothing, and I told myself this firmly and drove back to On Nut and felt for the first time in the whole miserable process that I had crossed a line I was not comfortable with. Not morally, exactly, more professionally. I had spent 30 years reading people and situations and making accurate assessments, and I had now been reduced to driving past buildings in the middle of the afternoon to verify my girlfriend's whereabouts. This was not the behavior of a man in control of his analytical faculties. This was the behavior of a man who knew something was wrong and was too frightened of confirmation to take the direct route to it. I confronted her once, indirectly, during this period. I told her, without specific accusation, that I had been feeling some distance between us lately and asked whether everything was all right with her. She said everything was fine. She asked if something was worrying me. I said I wasn't sure, that I sometimes felt she was preoccupied. She said she had been stressed about the online shop, a supplier issue with a product line that had been underperforming, and that she was sorry if she'd seemed distant, and that she loved me, and she reached across the table and took my hand. I noted the warmth of that gesture, the apparent sincerity of it, and I told myself that a woman who could look at me with that expression and take my hand with that warmth was not a woman who was conducting multiple parallel relationships. I had no idea, at that point, how wrong I was or how much practice it takes to produce exactly that expression on demand. The confrontation after I found the bank statements was different in every way. The indirect version, the worried inquiry across a dinner table, had given her room to operate, space to warm me back into comfort. The direct version, with the laptop turned toward her and the hotel charges in plain rows on the screen, gave her no room at all, and the difference in her responses was instructive. The first confrontation, she was warm and convincing, and I backed down within minutes. The second, she was calculating for the first second or two before the calculation gave way to something that might have been genuine distress. The warmth of the first confrontation was tactical. The distress of the second was at least partly real. I believe the distress was real because it was the first moment in our entire relationship when she was not in control of the narrative. What happened in the days immediately after she left was a particular kind of chaos that I hadn't anticipated and that I have heard described since by other men who have been through comparable discoveries. It was not the grief of losing someone you love, though that came too. It was the systematic destruction of memory. Every good thing I could recall about the 20 months we had spent together was now contaminated, or at least suspect. I couldn't look at a memory without turning it over to check what was on the other side. The first visit? The temple in Nonthaburi? The smoke and the incense, and her kneeling in that interior stillness real? Performed? How much of it was genuine, and how much was the opening presentation of a product she was selling? I didn't know. I couldn't know. The uncertainty made the memories feel toxic, and I found myself avoiding them the way you avoid a food you ate before you got sick. I also found myself performing a very specific kind of retroactive accounting. I went through the previous 20 months systematically, identifying every occasion on which her stated whereabouts didn't fully cohere, every gap that now had a different explanation from the one I had accepted at the time. The family illness weekend and Matthias visiting Bangkok, the late returns from Juanita, and the hotel on Phetchaburi Road. The Tuesday she'd had a headache and asked me to go for a walk on my own and suggested I try the market on Ekamai, and I'd come home 3 hours later to find her in the shower. I had been out of the apartment for 3 hours. I noted this and felt something very cold. I decided not to pursue that particular thread because I had all the information I needed, and some questions are better left without answers. I have thought a great deal about Pensri since returning to England. Not obsessively, the way I did in the first 2 months. The obsessive thinking has mostly subsided, replaced by something calmer and more analytical, which is at least a form of processing I'm comfortable with. What I think about most is the question of desperation and strategy, and where one ends and the other begins. She came from limited circumstances. Her mother worked long hours. Her brother's engineering degree was a financial stretch for the family. Her online business was real, and she worked at it genuinely, but its income was modest and uncertain. Foreign men who were attracted to her and willing to provide financial stability were a resource available to her in a way that was not available to most people in her position, and she used that resource. The question that troubles me, that I find I cannot answer satisfactorily, is at what point the use of an available resource becomes something we ought to call exploitation. I don't think she was a sociopath. The word gets used easily by men in my position as a way of explaining what happened without interrogating their own role. I don't believe she was without empathy or incapable of connection. I believe she had built a system that worked, and sustaining it required managing her empathy carefully to feel things in the allocated hours with each of us and compartmentalize when she was elsewhere. The system was rational, given her position. The skill it required was formidable. The combination was something I had not been equipped to recognize. The question of whether any of it was real is one I have arrived at a workable answer to. Some of it was real, and some was performed, and I cannot, and perhaps she could not, identify precisely where one became the other. The warmth she showed me was real warmth, expressed in service of a purpose it would not have been expressed in service of otherwise. The affection was genuine, allocated strategically. These things coexist in ways that make the binary of real or not real insufficient as a framework. This doesn't make what she did acceptable. It makes it more complicated than I initially wanted it to be, which is how most true things are. The house is quiet. I have been thinking about whether to go back to Thailand eventually, under different terms and with different knowledge, or whether that chapter is simply closed. I don't know yet. The country itself did nothing wrong. Bangkok is a city that contains extraordinary things alongside the things that hurt me, and it would be a particular kind of self-pity to confuse a person's failure with a place's character. I might go back. I might not. I'm in no hurry. For the first time in several years, I find that the quietness of the house is simply the quietness of a house, rather than the quietness of a man afraid of what his life has become. If there is a final thing I want to say, the thing beneath the lessons and the analysis and the reconstruction of what happened and why it is this. I was a man who needed something, and went looking for it, with insufficient caution and insufficient honesty about my own vulnerability. I found something that functioned like what I needed for long enough to believe it was real. It wasn't. That is all there is to it. And no amount of analysis, however thorough, makes it feel better or worse than what it is. A simple story, very common, about a person who wanted to be loved and was instead managed. The only way out of that kind of story is through it, and the only way through it is to see it clearly for what it was rather than for what you needed it to be. Look at the bank statement. That's the only practical wisdom I have. Everything else is just the explanation of why I didn't look at it for 16 months when the answer was there in plain figures all along.